words of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts be now and always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. This has been a very fun spring for me. Often I get the opportunity to prepare families with infants for baptism, and every once in a while I get the opportunity to, as I did shortly after I arrived here, I get the opportunity to prepare an adult for baptism. And those are certain kinds of conversations where we talk about sacraments and baptism and what it is and what it means to align ourselves with God's way of love. And then I get the opportunity every once in a while to talk to a 6-year-old about baptism. Every priest who thinks that they understand all of these things and have a keen theological understanding of the sacraments should welcome and embrace an opportunity to talk to a 6-year-old about sacraments. Where we started is with the idea that a sacrament, these gifts that God gives to the church, that God gives to us for what they can do for us, the sacraments are things that take a true thing that is true on the inside and bring it to the outside where it can be seen. So when we celebrate the sacrament of baptism, there is a true thing about how we are beloved and how we are forgiven and how we are dear and precious to God. And we take that true thing and in water and in oil and with a light and a candle, we make that visible on the outside. And the 6-year-old said, But that is what we do in baptism, in the Eucharist, in the anointing with oils and prayers for healing. We take things that are true on the inside, an inward and spiritual grace, and we make them visible on the outside, an outward and visible sign. And so that is what Jesus was giving us, the gift we were being offered when Jesus ate dinner with his friends and said, "Whenever you do this, remember me." It was the institution of a sacrament that takes things that are true on the inside and makes them visible on the outside. And yet at the same time, because God is full of paradox and wonder, it also takes things that are true on the outside. God's great love for us, our connection with one another, and it makes those things not only visible, but something you can hold and smell. Oh, this bread smells so good. Hold and smell and taste. And it takes that truth that is true on the outside and brings it inside, into our bodies, where we live that truth in our lives. And the sacrament of the Eucharist, the meal that Jesus shares with his friends, it gathers up so many threads that are familiar to them, that are familiar to us. It gathers up the threads of the story that we heard from Exodus, of the Passover, of leaving Egypt, where God took a true thing about the belovedness and the liberation of God's people, Israel, and made it true on the outside by bringing them safely into freedom. It takes true things about God's care for that people in the desert, the manna that they ate in the wilderness, God's care and nurture and feeding of them. It takes true things about humanity and our deep need for connection of one another. I spent a long time thinking that the meal that Jesus and his friends shared in that room was the Passover meal. But John says before the Passover, this meal that they are sharing is the one that my family knew as Christmas Eve lasagna. It wasn't Christmas dinner, But it was the day we all made it to Grandma's house and everybody came over and ate together, like we were going to eat together again on Christmas Eve, and we were going to eat together again on Christmas Day, and we were going to eat together again on Boxing Day. This is the meal where the people are all together in the same place. And what else would you do but eat together? It gathers up the thread of the change of relationship that happens when we share a meal. If you have sat down at a table and talked with someone over bread or soup or a 7-course delight, if you have shared a meal with someone, you know them in a way you didn't. Or do you remember that first meal that we shared together with the selection committee? We knew each other at the end of that very stressful lunch better than we did before we started. All of these threads, God's love and care for us, God's desire for our liberation, God's concern about the bodies we are in right now and the things that they need in order to be whole, our deep connection for one another, the way eating together changes us. There is something about both the way we eat together, the way we feed one another changes when we love one another. And the way we love one another changes when we eat together. And when we move through those two things, changing the way we love because of how we eat and changing the way we eat because of how we love, that dance is happening on holy, holy ground. And Jesus gathers up all of these things and he takes bread in his hand and he breaks it and he shares it. And he says, "Remember me when you do this." And this piece about the way the relationship changes when we share a meal, about the way that we are called to love one another, about our need, our human need for connection with one another. Jesus makes this visible too in the washing of feet. He takes this outside thing about how the only way we can live together, the only way we can find our wholeness, the only way we can reach our liberation is by serving one another and by caring not only for my wholeness and my liberation, but through my caring for your wholeness and your liberation. This is what love is. He says that you should serve one another and care for one another as I have loved you. Our well-being, our liberation, our life itself depends on each other. And our capacity to treat one another with love, which is, he says, real care for your wholeness, your liberation. Because there is one bread, broken and shared. God's love for us, our need to love and be loved by one another. God's care for our freedom and for our wholeness, for our wellness, for our connection. All of this gathered up in a meal that Jesus shared with his friends, because what else do you do when you're in the city with your friends and it's mealtime and you're hungry? Jesus takes the bread and breaks it and shares it, takes all these true things and invites them to eat it, to make it something they can see and touch and taste and smell. And as they do, he says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another." And so here we sit now, a people, a church, a group of his disciples, those who would follow him, perhaps more than anything else, formed by this meal that we remember and that we share. Who are we? We are the people that eat this bread. Because all of those things that are true enter into us, into our bodies, into our lives. We hope that we might then have strength to become the people that he describes, the people who are known by the way they love one another. This is the night. And we eat. And we love. Thanks be to God.